confess that when I first kind of saw the lineup you had today and I was looking over the different topics, I was worried that my topic wasn't going to fully integrate and that it wasn't completely connected to the rhythm of what you were doing. And then after that last speech, I was just sitting over there blown away at how much that was a manifestation of what was really on my mind and heart when I wrote this book. So I live in Newport Beach, and I run a wealth management firm called the Bahnsen Group. We run about $1.5 billion. Our main office is here with 16 employees, and I work about close to half the year at our New York City office, so I go back and forth all the time. At the time of the financial crisis, I was a managing director at Morgan Stanley, and I had been 10 years there, and obviously Morgan was a big investment bank and kind of involved themselves as an actor in the financial crisis. So after the financial crisis, set out to write not write a book, to read every single book that came out about the crisis. Am I in the way of your deal? Sorry about that. Thanks for telling me. I need to be responsible for where I'm standing. The financial crisis, and I imagine this is true of some of you, if not more than just a few of you, but it was a profound event in my life, biographically and professionally and personally and so forth. It was something that I changed out of. I think it was a career maker in my case, and what I mean by that was it dramatically revamped the way I think about an awful lot of things. I had a pretty good-sized business going into the crisis, but it was not just how it affected us from a revenue standpoint, profitability standpoint, things of that nature, but it was sort of the financial crisis enabling me to kind of rethink the way I thought about an awful lot of things in capital markets, professionally, within the organization I was tethered to. So it became kind of an obsession for me. And there are 75 books that have been written on the crisis. I've read every single one of them. And if you come to me and say, well, here's another book, and I haven't read it, I'm just going to say that I did, because I constantly say I've read all of them. So at this point, I have to just pretend like I've read them all. But I'm pretty sure I have, and if there's one I haven't, I can promise you that book doesn't say a single thing I didn't read in 9 other books. And that was kind of what I ended up discovering about halfway through. I reviewed 50 of these books, and I got to a point where I realized that more or less, there were a few different tweaks and turns and angles and lanes, but there was a particular belief about the financial crisis that I had that absolutely nobody had written a book on, and I'm going to explain what that is in a moment. And I was rather convinced that there was a sort of prevalent narrative. This is the one the history books will record. It is the one that the sort of mass population believes. That's kind of impossible to change. The winners generally write the history books, and more or less, the narrative is that there was a failure of capitalism, inadequate regulation, greed of Wall Street, so forth and so on, that caused the financial crisis. And the problem with critiquing it is it's got like a little bit of truth to it from my vantage point. I don't think it's entirely true, but it sort of has enough truth that you can't just blast it. And on the right, political right that is, there's a prevalent narrative. I think this has a lot of truth to it. There was a tremendous failure of government policy. There was the Fannie-Freddie issues and so forth and so on. And so you had, I think that I need to get caught up on my slides here. Let me walk through kind of the setup of what I'm talking about. The right might have been split a little bit because there were some kind of sub-narratives that the Fed did it or monetary policy. And there were always different little derivatives of these prevalent theories, but more or less it came down to some failure of some agency, some institution. Generally, which side you took probably came down to your political worldview, which way you kind of leaned in terms of your politics. No big deal, but what I became convinced of is that rather than blaming K Street or Wall Street, that the financial crisis was, from my vantage point, largely created by Main Street, but at best case, Main Street was a co-participant in what created what we called the financial crisis. And there was not a single book from the right or the left that was willing to present Main Street as anything other than a victim. And the question was only, who were they victimized by? Was Main Street victimized by Wall Street, or were they victimized by a failure of government policy? So I began working on a book on this subject. I was really, really passionate about it. And I left. I had at the time 9 employees, and I picked up my entire business, every client of ours, every employee, and I went and started my own firm about 4 years ago. And now, I wasn't going to write this book at Morgan Stanley, just so we're clear. It was not going to happen. And now I had the freedom to do it, and I got an agent who was really, really committed to this, and we had a number of publishers that were really kind of enthused about it. And then in the year 2016, the publisher and agent came to me and just said, what do you think about kind of expanding the book, not to be only about the financial crisis? There was this sort of general discontent in society. You saw it manifest itself across the pond with Brexit. We know about the whole kind of Trump phenomena, regardless of what people liked and didn't like. That obviously, he was born out of a kind of certain discontent into the society. And there was this angst of the masses taking place. And you had a lot of competing narratives that correlated, I think, to what I was believing about the financial crisis. And that was largely that there was some institution and some larger body than oneself that was responsible for the state of affairs in people's lives, and that those people were going to have to punish those institutions or agents or actors for what the state of their life was, whether that be politically, governmentally, or in other cases, the media and things of that nature that are largely blamed for those things. I think just as a general, you put an economist up, and by the way, I'm doing this, I got 11 minutes, 10 seconds to go. I started with 18 minutes. I've given this talk about 50 times, and a couple times I did it in 45 minutes. Most of the time I do it in an hour and a half. So you're going to get it in 11 minutes, I promise. But I did take a lot of slides out. So this is kind of, at the end of the day, my belief. If one is not looking to very personalize and from a micro standpoint understand the angst of the masses, at the end of the day, I can't really come up with a better way to encapsulate from pretty much the time period that most of us were either very young or entering adult lives, or in some cases not even born yet, the mid-60s all the way through now. You've had a 3.1% real GDP number, global growth. You've gone below that, you've gone above that, but when you look at the trend line, you can barely tell. When I have a little light on this, maybe not. You can barely even tell. The trend line has been so rock solid consistent. And effectively, after the financial crisis, that was a particularly severe dip, why we call it the Great Recession. It was the biggest drop, both US and globally, relative to since the Great Depression. But then the recovery out of that has been fully, completely incapable of getting back to real GDP. So, from a broad economic standpoint, it is 100% accurate. I have a lot of opinions as to what some of the things are that are forcing that sub-trend line GDP growth on a global basis. But if we had trend line global growth, do I believe the masses would be as angst-filled as they are? I do not. However, that economic growth is now, that economic subpar growth has now combined with cultural forces that I also believe began around the 1960s. The famous sociologist out of Harvard and MIT, Charles Murray, wrote a book in 2013 called Coming Apart, one of the great books written in the last 10 years, describing kind of this phenomena, that there is essentially a tremendous gap, not just economically. We talk a lot in this country about income inequality, but culturally. And you have this broad failure, I think in a lot of cases accurately. Even if you don't believe that, you certainly have a perception of a lot of failure amongst the elites and the institutions. And so when I evaluate the lay of the land and use the financial crisis and my beliefs about that incident that we're going to spend a few minutes talking about, you got to a point, and this is kind of what he was referring to in the way people evaluate their own professional well-being and personal well-being. One of the great things that gets in the way of anyone's ability to succeed is this concept of blame casting. I happen to be, and my speech is not going to be centered around this, and I think I'm able to even deliver the speech where you wouldn't know, but many people wouldn't believe that about me. I happen to be a very, very, very conservative Republican type guy. However, this is the most nonpartisan and bipartisan thing I will ever talk about in my life, because I think it is equally systemic and endemic from the right and the left right now. And like I said about the financial crisis, the only question is which institution is going to be blamed. There is a tremendous force and momentum behind a certain factor of society that wants to blame the government or media for their problems, and a significant force that wants to blame corporations or any number of other kind of institutional issues. And I believe this is something relatively new. And the largest example, if I go back over 100, 200 years, of a real society-changing event that brought about a almost universal form of blame casting, and what I call in the book the crisis of responsibility, was the financial crisis. I think so that we find ourselves now with the experiment of large institutions, large centralized experiments having failed, and you have this angst of the masses. And I'm here to say, and I'm going to conclude today with both individual, personal, suggested remedies, and then more societal, cultural, macro suggested remedies. And again, obviously, it's what I wrote the book about. But to use the financial crisis as kind of the setup or narrative around it, I talked before about the belief that Wall Street did it, this big excessive greed. The right with the government did it. There's kind of a fringe out of the right that would say the Fed did it. My belief here is that we did it, that it was a moral crisis, cultural covetousness ran amok, and I'm going to try to explain how we did it. And just in the interest of time, I'll go quickly through this. The book in chapter 4 divides up Main Street into 4 different segments. So if I'm calling a group of people the swindled, you can probably guess I'm not blaming them for what happened, because by definition the term is very purposely meant to connotate that they are victims. They were swindled. So there's this very, very small percentage of people. Statistically, we're not really able to identify more than 0.1% of all loans that were generated from 2002 to 2006, where I think there was like real fraud and paper switching and things like that, people that genuinely didn't know what their rate was going to be and payment and so forth. I'm not counting them, so let's just take them out of the equation. And I'm going to come back to the reckless and the gamblers, and you can probably guess I'm not including the diligent in the mix either. If a name has such a virtuous connotation, they're probably not caught up in this crisis of responsibility either. So you take the 2 outliers, those really, really, really diligent people. I'm going to guess a lot of the people that would be called the diligent are here in this room right now. And those would be people that made their payments, that continued to function through the difficult times, and were not responsible through what was taking place in the society at large. But you look to the reckless and the gamblers, and it's very difficult for me in the data I go through in the book to really distinguish between the 2 in some cases. But I do allow for the fact that there is a kind of categorical difference. People that maybe believed it was going to work, they wanted it to, they weren't maybe the most educated, but they were reckless, they were irresponsible. They went forward, even if they didn't, in their mind, completely intellectually understand. They have a moral responsibility to kind of go forward in a transaction, take responsibility for what they're doing, and they went forward with it recklessly. Did they get to a position where they could not afford their home payment? They did, but they did so because of their own recklessness. And we can have sympathy, and we can have, kind of that human response to it, but we can't identify it as anything different than it was. It was somewhat irresponsible behavior. The gamblers are a lot easier for us to identify, and I think the gamblers are where an awful lot of people have a pretty understandable moral indignation against. And I don't know if any of you know people like this. To the extent any of you were these people, just forgive me, or I'm going to get the hell out of here real quick when we're done. But the gamblers were people that just literally knew that they had a perfectly asymmetrical bet. Heads, I win. Tails, I won't lose a thing. I will go buy 5 houses. If it all goes well, I will make money. If it doesn't go well, I will walk away. And they not only did it consciously, they did it rather efficiently. And that was, I think, the systemic piece that put the Alt-A coverage of the loan community over the edge in 2007. It's all really documented throughout the book. But see, I'm going through a kind of financial dynamic and giving certain categorizations, obviously doing it quickly. But the thing that grabbed me, this financial crisis, by the way, we're in the month of the 10-year anniversary, as you know. Today's the 27th, so the 25th of 08 was when Washington Mutual went bankrupt. The 26th is when Wachovia turned over. 14th was Lehman Brothers. 15th, Merrill Lynch. 16th was AIG. 17th were Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, changed forever. Now, this coming Saturday is the 29th. It was a Monday in 08, but that was the day that TARP didn't pass, and the stock market dropped the most points it ever had in a day. and you go forward through this progression. That's what we're kind of commemorating the 10-year anniversary of now. Well, there's a lot of financial and economic profundity around what was taking place 10 years ago. But culturally, I don't think 1991 was that long ago. I especially didn't think it was that long ago in 2008. I mean, there's been another decade, but 17 years. And yet you had a national default rate with 20% of Americans underwater on their home in 1990-91, and a national default rate of less than 1%. And in 17 years, the amount of people who are underwater on their home had doubled, but the amount of people who defaulted on their loan went up 10,000% from where it had been. So there was something that had dramatically changed, and what brought this out of just an economic analysis, but it became much more of a cultural one, was that not only were people systemically capable of walking away from their obligations, and so much had changed around this picture economically, but they could go to the bar on Friday night here in Orange County and brag about it. And it was something that I was unable to reconcile myself to morally. There was a tremendous amount of greed and covetousness on Wall Street, and we go through and document it in the book. But there was an incredible amount of covetousness on Main Street as well. And that's my thesis around how the book itself took, how the financial crisis took place and where there's a broader cultural story to it. So right now we look at the national controversy and the political heat and toxicity around immigration, around free trade, around the way people view the media. Wall Street's always been pretty easy to beat up on, and Wall Streeters don't do a lot to pacify that. But you know, one's view of government, et cetera. There's a real easy bag of people to pick on, and yet I'm arguing, I'm going to skip through the policy side of things, that we have a much bigger issue than just what boogeyman we want to beat up for our problems, but that it is from inside individual responsibility, that there's an infantilization taking place, a deferred maturity, a deferred adulthood that has become systemic in much of American society. He talked about greater individual responsibility leading to greater relationships, you becoming a better husband, father, sister, brother. You have this declining family unit. It's no wonder, regardless of what one's view of the size of government ought to be, it is inevitable you either have a tremendous failure in individualism or a tremendous failure in collectivism. Both big political movements, so to speak, will fail when the middle mediating institutions of family, church, community, businesses, civic organizations are all swallowed out of the society. That hollowed middle, I think, has become a huge problem. So as my time wraps, that's a beautiful noise. My personal antidotes, I wrap up chapter 11 of the book with. There were 10 of them, and I'm just quickly putting the highlights here. I lay out a very significant doctrine of repudiating victimhood. Repudiating victimhood is very easy when you weren't really a victim, like when you keep telling yourself that someone else is to blame, but they weren't, and so now you have to learn not to blame them anymore. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to repudiating victimhood even when you really were victimized. I'm a big advocate of people engaging local politics, putting an end to our obsession with federal Washington, D.C. politics. The cult of home ownership, the way we view our home, viewing it as a place to live and project community stability and raise a family instead of a trading card, rejecting the social safety net if you don't really need it, and most importantly, from an existential standpoint, viewing yourself and you all as business owners and actors, I think, can relate to this more than most people. But the notion of our function here in society being to consume as opposed to produce, I think, is creating an unbelievable amount of collateral damage. Refocusing our efforts around how we produce. First of all, economically, we cannot consume unless someone else first produced, and we cannot consume unless we first produce so that we can afford to consume what someone else produced. There are two benefits to a focus on production. We enable others to consume, and existentially, we drive self-worth and human dignity. And I'll spare you my sermon on family as a building block. The cultural aspects we don't have time for, but that's what the last chapter of the game gets into, and of the book gets into. And I hope that, are we doing a Q&A? Outside the patio. I think that 18 minutes, I should have been able to pull 3 minutes off of this, but I'm telling you that this was literally an hour the other times I've done it. So anyways, that was the thesis that we wrote the book around. You can tell it covers a lot of topics, and there's a lot of utility and application. I don't want to keep you guys away from the bar. That would be very irresponsible of me. But thank you for hearing me out on our crisis of responsibility.